Whenever I tell this story, I always start it in the same way. I don't care if anyone believes me. Either you do and so you can empathize with me, or you don't. So you think I've created this terrifying experience out of thin air. Either way, it doesn't matter to me. This story is completely true. There is something stalking the Mesquite Thickets of East New Mexico. Several years ago, I was working at a dude ranch in southeast New Mexico. My job was incredibly enjoyable, and I made some of my closest friends out there, including my fiancée. The landscape was absolutely gorgeous. The ranch occupied almost 2,000 acres of rolling prairie and scrubland, with the back half being thickets of cactus and mesquite. The edge of the property was part of the Tonkawa River with a huge field leading down the hill to the bank. I'm creating a map of the property because locations will become important to the story. The first time I saw anything that gave me pause was one of my first nights at the ranch. We were due for some rain that night, and in the morning I had to demonstrate how to start a fire to a group I was taking out on trail. Not wanting to embarrass myself with wet wood, I had the bright idea to go gather some before it started raining. Unfortunately for me, this was around 10 p.m. and was the only bright thing that night. We were about 40 minutes outside the nearest town, and with the sky being overcast, my weak little flashlight barely illuminated the path ahead of me. We had this huge old oak tree just right in front of the tree line, and that was my destination. After a bit of a walk, you got to the tree and started piling wood into bucket I brought. I've never had much of a problem with being out in the woods at night, but that night was so dark it was difficult to keep my thoughts from straying into eerie places. After a couple minutes, I felt like I was being watched. I started to glance around, but the hair-raising sensation of no longer being alone became a bit overwhelming, and I was less and less confident being out there. As I turned around towards the trail, I froze. Staring out of the darkness were two glowing green eyes. They didn't blink or move, just stared at me. They were roughly 40 feet away on the other side of the path I had to reach. My gut wrenched, it was just so unnerving. I slowly walked forward till I got to the path and then started to back away, never turning my back from them. My flashlight was too dim to ever see what the eyes belonged to, but just the fact I had to look slightly up at them made my skin crawl. Finally, when I judged I was far enough away, I turned and ran down the path back down to the road into our guest area and to my house. The morning after, I had to run a camera to a group that was gathering at the oak tree. As I was leaving, I realized that place where the eyes had been was a clearing. The eyes were roughly in the middle of the clearing, and it was large enough, in diameter, that there was no way they could have belonged to something in a tree. I'm well over 6 feet tall. Based off of how far back I had to tilt my head to meet its gaze, it was easily over 7 feet tall. The realization made my blood run cold. Now, of course, nobody believed me at first. But this was only my first encounter with whatever prowled those woods, and the only one where I was ever alone. My second run-in with this thing about 4 months later in June. New summer staff arrived, and I was the only carryover into a new season. In our staff lounge one evening, I joined a group of about 9 other staff sharing creepy stories. My friend Elijah was in the middle of a doozy, and when he was finished, he begged me to tell mine again. He'd heard it before, but he was the only one. I told everybody I could tell them or I could show them where it happened. Of course, everybody elected to go out to the oak with me. Once we were there, I told my tale and left everyone sufficiently on edge. The mood was still light, and since we were out there anyway, Elijah suggested we head out to a large boulder deeper in the trees. The group was even between guys and girls, and there was a definite flirtatious vibe between most, so we agreed. Now, to get to this boulder, we would cross through the pasture that led down to the river, and afterwards down this very narrow path where the brush was so thick and the trail was so windy, you couldn't get more than around 10 feet of visibility, in front and behind you, with nothing on either side. I unzipped the tent and peered out with my light into the tree line. I couldn't see anything, but I could tell from the singing that whatever it was just out of my view, less than 100 feet from the tent. It knew where we were, and didn't care if we knew where it was. I told Haley to run to the car. She scrambled out of the tent and ran through the dark towards her car. I followed, barefoot, only in shorts, with my knife and phone clutched in my hand. We made to the car as the singing became deafeningly loud. We sped back to our lodging and spent the night wide awake in her room, her lying on her bed and I propped against the door, occasionally checking the windows. Well into morning, we drove back to pick up our stuff. The tent had been torn apart. Everything else was ransacked. A horrible odor pervaded the clearing. What sent shivers down my spine, however, were the massive scratches and gouges in the tree nearest where the tent lay scattered. We finished up our contract and quickly moved to Colorado together. We also work at a ranch up here, and I'm glad to say, nothing about the woods up here feel malevolent. I've never heard any singing or seen any wrong deer, or been asked for help from any weird voices. I'm completely content to stay far away from the Mesquite Thickets of New Mexico for the rest of my life. We made it through the pasture with no difficulty besides Elijah scaring one of the girls by jumping out from behind a tree. Once on the narrow path, we had to walk two abreast, and my other buddy Alexander and I took up the rear. He and I were the only two who heard the voice, calling out from the pasture we were just at. It almost seemed female, but was completely devoid of emotion or pain. Calling out softly, "Ow, help me." Alexa and I looked at each other, our eyes huge. I'm sure I was also as pale as he looked. There should have been nobody else out there with us. Our group were the only ones who had the night off, and it wasn't very plausible that a group of guests would be out there, and we didn't encounter them. Besides, anyone trying to mess with us surely would have just screamed or just even said, "More." I cannot begin to describe how wrong the voice was. The tone and inflection were almost robotic, and "Ow, help me" was all it said. We started to hurry everyone else up without freaking them out, and we came out of that section of trail, with the two of us looking behind us constantly. When we got to the boulder, we tried to convince everyone to head back, but to no avail. Finally, Alex and I said we were going to leave, but as we turned around, we all saw the deer. It was on the trail we'd just exited, just standing there, watching us, but so much of it was wrong. It was much taller than any other deer we'd seen out there, and there were plenty. It was also somehow longer and crooked. Its head almost looked like it was put on sideways to its neck. It just stood there looking at us, its appearance generally unnerving. But what it did next was why frightened me the most. It backed up into the trees until we could no longer see it. That's what freaked me out the most. Every deer I've ever seen either turns outright and runs away, or just freezes till you get too close. This one just backed up out of sight. It was such a simple movement, but it was so unnatural, exactly like the call for help. We all looked around at each other nervously for a few minutes, then scrambled off the rock. When we were all huddled in a group, we ran, together past where we'd seen it last, tore across the pasture, and past the oak tree, till we stood panting on the porch of the lounge. We never really spoke of that night together again, but I always included in any retelling of this story. I have one more large encounter, the one that made me refuse to go back in the woods after dark. One thing you must understand is that there were several months between these three accounts. Enough time for me to think, surely whatever that was isn't still here, right? The final time I went out into those woods was with my now fiancé. She and I had just started officially dating about a week before this terrible camping trip. I'd grown up camping as a kid, but she'd never been. Wanting to share with her something I found incredibly meaningful to my early life, I convinced her to join me for a one-night trip out into the woods. My plan was to go out there Friday evening through Sunday morning, and since she had to work, Saturday she joined me for my final night out there. Friday night was completely uneventful. I pitched my tent out off of one of the dirt access roads in one of the spots used for overnight groups. It was a very average solo camping trip. I enjoyed myself completely. The next Saturday, my fiancée Haley drove up the dirt road to join me. It was once again a very nice evening, making hot dogs and s'mores, and after a couple beers, we retired to the tent. As we settled down for the night, we both heard something out in the woods. Haley turned to ask me if I'd also heard something, but I regretfully snapped at her to be quiet. There was no anger, but at that sound, the other two frightening stories I had were at the forefront of my mind. The sound we heard was very faint. If it hadn't lasted more than a few seconds, it could have been dismissed as wind, but it lasted much longer. It was singing, but completely toneless, devoid of any kind of humanity. It grew steadily louder, making wide half circles towards our campsite. Our site was in a clearing off an access road. We were way out past the boulder from a few months previous. This clearing was surrounded by prickly pear and mesquite, basically creating a massive barbed wire fence around us. The only clear spot was the path that led to the road, but the singing was coming from the opposite end of the clearing. Something was out in the woods, making its way through thorns and scrub, singing in a language we'd never heard before. Haley looked as terrified as I felt. This is a real interact I had happen to me a few days ago, and I don't know what to do about it. No crime was committed, but it threw me for a loop. I'm posting my experience here just to share. For context, I, M22, work for a car auction house. We are a large property that stores thousands of vehicles and prepares to sell them in an auction on behalf of dealerships that partner with us. We also have customers coming in to inspect cars before bidding. Being a car guy myself, I understand why. If you're going to bid money on it, you at least want to know the state it's in. The property is located in a small town and just off a major road, and is boxed in by a shopping outlet and woods. Electrical fences topped with barbed wire surround the property. A few years back, a group of thieves came in through the woods and stole a couple of Mercedes. Safe to say, no one can just climb over the fence. Only way in is the main building entrance, the vehicle entrance exit gate, and vehicle drop-off gate. For my specific job, the company gives me a vehicle to drive around in on the property. I also have a company phone chargers, jumper cables, and a radio. I bring snacks for myself, a book, or watch Netflix and YouTube for when the day is slow. So for most of my day, I'm sitting in a barely running Chevy Malibu, driving around, sending emails on my work phone, and locating vehicles. A decent little office space on wheels where no one bothers me. This happened to me on my 1-hour lunch break. If you're like me, you know that daily life and routines can steal time from your sleep. So I fix this by getting any naps in when I can. I'm sure I'm not the only one who takes 10 to 15 minutes to eat and then 30 minutes to nap. I took my time to drive up to the punch-out machine in the main building and clocked out for lunch. I drove over to a little corner of the property to have my lunch in peace. I parked my car and manual locked the driver's side and passenger side doors. I'm a bit paranoid. After I eat my lunch, I throw the seat back, turn the AC on low, set an alarm, and close my eyes to take a nap. I don't go into a full sleep ever. It's more of the in-between of deep sleep and being fully awake. I noticed the sound of faint tapping on my window. When I opened my eyes, nothing was there, so I went back to sleep. I'm not sure how much time went by, but I swore my heart nearly exploded when I heard the attempt of my car door being opened. I shot up and looked to see a middle-aged man staring at me. His eyes were wide, but his face didn't show any expression like being surprised or startled. He was just looking at me. I cracked the window a little bit. "Can I help you?" After I spoke, his hand left the door handle and he placed his fingers in the opening of the window. He leaned in closer to peek his eyes through and level them with my face. His behavior was unnerving. It felt like he was trying to get as close as possible to me. In a voice that sounded like broken English, he said, "Jump, please, sir." I knew what he was asking for, but I wasn't going to give it to him. Not just because he freaked me out, but I also didn't want to step out of the car. I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'5" and 180 lbs of muscle. I've boxed and taken mixed martial arts. I can handle myself, but this guy gave me the creeps. Kind of like how freaked out you get when a bug is too close to your face. His slowed and focused movements reminded me of a predator about to catch its prey. I looked at the clock and saw I still had 20 minutes of my break before I had to drive to clock back in. I'm on my lunch break right now. I get off in 20 minutes. If you stay by your vehicle, I could get someone to help you afterwards. His eyes stayed fixed on me, and then his mouth did something. I don't know how to describe it, but it moved in a way I didn't know it could. Have you ever had a muscle spasm? Your arm or leg muscles twitch in a rapid manner. That's what his lower jaw did. It just twitched. He stared at me for a few more seconds. Through it felt like an hour passed. He pulled his hand back, letting his fingers that were hooked inside the window slide up and out. He stood up and turned back around to start walking away. I assumed he went to go right back to whatever car he was looking to buy, but I watched him walk all the way back to the main building. I think he just left the property. Come to think of it, I don't know if he was a customer or not. Usually customers come in and are holding like a paper list for the cars they want to check out. This guy had nothing in his hands. The way he walked was robotic. His arms were kept at his side and he didn't sway when he walked. No shoulder movement. Just one leg forward, then the next. I don't think I even saw him blink the entire time I was face to face with him.